Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad to get to see you and glad you got the message that we had switched our location. And what a disappointment that we could not all be in the same place physically at the same time. But what a blessing that we actually know how to do this now, to be all at the same place on the same venue in this way. So grateful for that. Today is the day that we celebrate the consecration and ordination of Bishop Barbara Harris. And I have found thinking about her all day to be just the tonic for all that is going on out of Washington at the moment. So I'm going to use her prayer to start us. And then after the prayer, I'll turn over to Father Andy Olivo, who will introduce today's speaker. Let us pray. God of the prophets, we give you thanks for calling Barbara Clementine Harris to the office of bishop. Open our eyes to behold the wondrous works you have prepared for your church and calling women to share in the mystery of the episcopate and the ministry of the episcopate. May we, inspired by their example as faithful shepherds, wise teachers, courageous prophets, and guardians of the faith, proclaim the good news and carry out the works of Jesus Christ in the world, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
I think that was a Freudian stumble over the word ministry to call it the mystery of the episcopate. Sometimes it does feel like the mystery. Over to you, Father Andy.
Thank you, Bishop Hughes. Good evening, my friends. It's really good to see you all on Zoom tonight. As the bishop said, I'm Andy Olivo. I'm the rector of St. Elizabeth's Church here in Ridgewood, New Jersey. As I said a couple weeks ago, I've had the privilege of serving on the Diocesan Sesquicentennial Committee with a number of folks who are on this Zoom call tonight. My role was to work with those good folks to find speakers for our four-part speaker series. And I think the speaker that we'll hear tonight was the first person who, as soon as I reached out to him, immediately said, absolutely, I'll do it. And so I'm grateful for that. But I just want to say a word of thanks to my fellow committee members as we conclude this speaker series tonight in this portion of our celebration of the Diocese of Newark. I also want to thank Bishop Hughes for her support, the support of her staff, especially Chloe Caprice, who has done so much of the kind of behind the scenes legwork, logistic work to work with these speakers and their assistants to make everything happen. It's really been a team effort. So thank you to all those folks. As I said tonight, we conclude our series, and as Bishop said, while we had hoped to be in person, I'm grateful for everyone's flexibility and the flexibility of our speaker, his willingness to join us on Zoom. He was going to bring copies of his book to sell to us all tonight. And since we're not at St. Elizabeth's in person, that means that everyone on this call has to commit to buying a copy of his book. And I'll put a link in the chat here in a few minutes so that you can go online and do that if you've not done it already. Our speaker tonight is a nationally and internationally known broadcaster, journalist, podcaster, and author. You've likely seen or heard him on PBS, on NPR, CNN, ABC, CBS, Al Jazeera America, sort of name it, and I bet you've seen him or heard him on one of those places. His essays and opinion pieces have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other major newspapers. His most recent book, the one that we will all be purchasing, is called We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century in Oral History. And in it, he writes about what it means to be an immigrant. And he talks about that how when he was working on this book, he went all over and talked to people from all corners of the world and then compiled their stories in this new book. And it really is a fascinating and wonderful read. And so I commend it to you. Lastly, the last thing that I'll say about Mr. Suarez is that he is an active Episcopalian. He regularly speaks about our church, about his faith, and about lots of other religious topics. He also has a connection to an Episcopal priest that some of us may know, the Reverend Canon Ava Suarez, his daughter, who serves as the canon for community engagement at a church that has just a tiny little footprint in New York City called the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Some of you maybe have heard of that place. And so I'm delighted, I'm privileged to get to welcome Mr. Suarez. His topic tonight is our church and the next America. And so thank you, Ray, for being here. And I turn the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a joy for me to be with you tonight as part of your marking, celebrating, contemplating 150 years as the church on this branch of the vine in this corner of the vineyard. Big anniversaries like this one are naturally a time for throwing out your chest, remembering baptisms, weddings, confirmation classes, cathedral days, sepia-toned photographs of cornerstones being laid, of distinguished-looking gents in old-fashioned glasses that hang in our offices and in our parish halls, dignified posed photos of vestries and altar guilds, and later color photographs on church lawns, crucifers, sacristans, chasubles, mitres, the whole kaleidoscopic feast of being us, who you have been in this network of parishes spread across northern New Jersey. And from its earliest days, a mixture of farm and forest, tenement and suburb, from the Church of the Good Shepherd in Wantage, starting as a house church, older than the diocese, tucked up not too far from that spot where Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York all meet, all the way down to Hoboken, where All Saints, created from 3 historic parishes, brings love and care to a changing city. The population density of Wantage Township is 161 people per square mile. The population density of Hoboken is 48,000 people per square mile, literally 300 times greater, more thick with people. And here you all are, bound together in our dazzling diversity by accident, by history, by a historic faith, and a determination that there is a future for us, for our particular way of being Christian in this country. It's why you're marking this birthday, which invokes, even if it's quietly, the next 150 years. And what kind of United States, what kind of New Jersey, what kind of Episcopal Church, and what kind of diocese will mark the 200th, 250th, and 300th birthdays of this institution, all the way out in 2074, 2124, and 2174. I will tell you in advance that I won't be available to accept any invitation to be your speaker at any of those events, whatever the weather is like. When some of the oldest Anglican churches in this part of the colonies were established by the British Crown, it's a safe bet that even the most visionary clergy sailing over from England could not have imagined a teeming Jersey City, a Newark airport, that skyline across the river, traffic belching onto superhighways from choked tunnels, or rumbling across that glittering river over that majestic bridge. They couldn't have imagined a United States. They couldn't have imagined a bishop who was not white, or, let's be honest, perhaps even more incredible, a bishop who was not a man. And yet, here we are. When this diocese was founded, the Congress of the United States had only recently passed the Civil War amendments, which ended slavery in the United States and made Black people who had been here for centuries citizens of the places they had lived since Jamestown for 2.5 centuries. And for many years after that, only white people and the Black people specifically implicated in the post-war constitutional amendments could become naturalized citizens of the United States. Under various laws, Asians could not emigrate or if they could emigrate, could not naturalize as American citizens. A few years ago, I was given a sweatshirt after an address much like this one that says, "I am my ancestors' wildest dreams." Well, let me assure you, this America, this New Jersey, this mix of souls from different places across our amazing planet, making up the Diocese of Newark, led by a woman named Carly, this church is far beyond our ancestors' wildest dreams. So what are we supposed to do now? At a time when Americans are leaving church at a rate unseen in our history, when the American exception that made this country different from the rest of the wealthy industrialized world is fading, and living in community with others in a religious congregation is becoming a less common, and in some cases, unimaginable way to live. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells his followers he knew there were many who did not believe. "For this reason I've said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted him from the Father." As a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. Then Jesus said to the 12, "Do you also want to go away?" And Peter replied, "Lord, to whom shall we go?" Imagine him saying, not to the 12, but to the 335 million, "Do you also want to go away?" We can't call time out until we figure out what to do. This country is constantly shifting. It's a mutating organism, and our challenges are many moving forward. In the late 50s, when there were about 175 million people in this country, 3.5 million of us were Episcopalian. Now, in a country almost twice the size, we gather in some 1.5 million. But that late 50s America, massively majority white, massively majority Christian, is not the mission field that faces us today. It's a vastly more complicated country. Even during the massive first wave of immigrants, mostly from Europe, that lasted 80 years from the mid-1840s to the mid-1920s, most newcomers were Christian. We didn't have it in the statute that we wanted only Christian immigrants, but by first putting out the welcome mat for and then writing into practice in statute that we wanted mainly European immigrants, it was predictable that the United States would become a majority of Christians with a small scattering of Jews. Muslims and others were brought to the United States not as immigrants, but as property from the 17th to the 19th century, forced into slavery in North America and forbidden from practicing their ancestral religion, and eventually, in large numbers, converted to Christianity. So even as a nation of immigrants, this country, even as late as 1965, was almost entirely Christian, with that small, steady Jewish minority heavily east of the Mississippi. By opening up the map of the world, by junking the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, by getting rid of the 1924 quotas and formulas that favored Europe, and starting to bring in more people from Asia, East and South, from Africa and Latin America, we remade the demographics not only of American race, but American religion in a few short years, even as at the same moment, Americans of longer family histories were walking away from the religion of their forebears. As the numbers of unaffiliated has grown, so has the number of Hindus, the number of Muslims from the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. As more and more immigrants begin or continue their families' American journeys, not in religious and ethnic ghettos in center cities the way they did 125 years ago, but increasingly in the suburbs. Sikh gurdwaras, mosques, Buddhist temples, Spanish-speaking Pentecostal megachurches are joining the landscape along suburban arterial roads with the more familiar First Presbyterian or Prestonwood Baptist and today's giant non-denominational Protestant churches, complexes that sometimes look more like community colleges than they do places of worship. One of the places I take the reader in We Are Home is an enormous Hindu temple in the Dallas suburbs. Another is a growing multinational immigrant Muslim congregation in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And to a fascinating young Episcopal mission in Dearborn, Michigan, led by a young priest named Halim Shukher, a Lebanese Virginia Theological Seminary graduate who was asked by the Bishop of Michigan to grow an Arabic-speaking congregation in a church whose foundation stone was laid by Mrs. Henry Ford. Father Halim leads a religiously diverse Episcopal congregation drawn from Israel and the Palestinian lands, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt, while almost all his flock was raised Christian. None, not one, except for Father Halim, was raised as an Anglican. He's working on an Arabic translation of the Book of Common Prayer, and in a very American move, he adds an English summary to his weekly sermons for the younger members of the congregation who can't always easily follow everything he says in Arabic. So in the same moment, it's a new story and a very old American one at the same time. One early winter, I killed time before an afternoon appointment in Minneapolis. I was sitting at a high counter looking out the window of a Starbucks at the Calhoun Square Mall. It's not far from where Mary Tyler Moore threw her hat up in the air for years on TV. A black man in a long overshirt and a heavy jacket to hold off the early winter wind, his close-cropped hair topped by a knit kufi hat, was stopping passers-by to hand them Muslim literature. He stopped all kinds of people, but he seemed to devote special attention to young adult men. Civil war in Somalia had sent people streaming out of that equatorial country in the 1990s, and the snowy Twin Cities became the home of the largest Somali community in the U.S., some 100,000 strong. As I nursed my coffee and flipped through a magazine, I noticed his approach change. The assignment no longer seemed to be passing leaflets out to waiting hands. Now the tall, broad-shouldered, and gregarious street proselytizer had convinced a small group of people to stop on a windy Hennepin Avenue. He now led 2 short rows of men in afternoon prayer, Asr, one of the 5 appointed prayer times each day for observant Muslims. In unison, the men touched their head to the red brick paving stones in front of the mall. Minnesota, long kidded affectionately on public radio's A Prairie Home Companion as the home of church suppers, Lutheran choirs, Midwestern Reserve, and a decidedly unshowy private flavor of religion, was now the home of something new. Some shoppers carrying bags from the mall stopped for a moment in respectful silence, watched a ritual that had traveled to Minneapolis from very far away. Others politely stepped around the kneeling men lined up in short rows on the sidewalk as they headed to their next destination. This was only 10 years after 9/11, and at the time, I wondered how well such a scene would play in other parts of this big and complicated country. If after I retire in the next few years, I could head to seminary for a graduate degree, I would want to watch closely what the newest Americans do. Will they, as they acculturate, as their tenures here in the U.S. lengthen, as their children reach adulthood and have their own children, become religiously more like their native-born neighbors, that is, leaving congregational affiliation altogether, or will they remain somewhat distinct, holding on a little longer? They could disaffiliate at a similar level to native-born Americans, even as they carry a distinctive set of facial features and skin tones into the future, while not carrying their ancestral faith. It could mean, over time, converting. One of the people I profile in the book is a deacon in an Ethiopian church. His youngest congregants are no longer familiar with the separate liturgical language used in Ethiopian worship, Giz, or with the ethnic language Amharic? Will they marry out, join similar but more American congregations that worship in English? Will they marry Black Americans and become Baptist or AME congregants? A Hindu mother of 2 college-age sons told me she thought both of her boys will marry in the faith, and if they don't, will still remain Hindu. And her confidence is buoyed by the families she sees at Temple, with intermarried couples where both parents are encouraging their children in Hindu learning. Will a particularly American style of Islam grow in this country, one where more of the preaching and the teaching goes on in English, even as Arabic prayer remains central? In what ways will Muslim immigrant families resemble Roman Catholic families earlier in American history, who built churches, brought in priests and nuns from faraway countries to keep a bit of Croatia, of Poland, of Italy, of Ireland alive in church, and then only found that ethnocultural orientation didn't make the leap to the suburbs after World War II. It's all fascinating stuff. I think it will make for great scholarship in coming decades, even as the country overall becomes less religious. So where do you fit in this unfolding story, Diocese of Newark? If we do nothing, we decline. If we do nothing, many of the churches represented here today will die, will close or merge or fade away. When I was in the Ozarks last fall, I was speaking to a professor of religion at Missouri State University who mentioned in passing, as his wife was Methodist clergy, the Episcopalians didn't even get to this part of the country until the late 1850s. There are a lot of the places in this country that can say something similar. We were latecomers, or we didn't bother to come at all. While other religious bodies proselytized, evangelized, plunged into the growing public square in the Great Plains, the Rockies, the West, we simply left a rapidly growing country to others for a long time. It would be a tragedy if we make a different version of that 19th century mistake again here in the 21st century and don't look inside the places we already live for people who would want to be with us, who might not even know it yet. The mission field is all around us, but that might mean a tough balancing act, keeping what people say they already love about the Episcopal Church, while being aware of what ways of praising God and being in community come in through the door with people from other traditions, other countries, other branches of the church. And we, let's face it, we really like who we are, and we are not easily open to big change. So that might make the assignment both a matter of growth versus stagnation and a challenge to accepted and popular modes of worship, and striking that balance is the key to the future. Why? Why do we have to make these choices at all? Well, Pew Research, PRRI, pastor, professor, and statistician Ryan Burge regularly come out with graphs on where things stand in American religious life. Today, which congregationally active people are the best educated? The top 3 in every graph: Hindus, Jews, and Episcopalians. And it's no surprise when you look at family income, because of how much income and education is associated in this country. Among congregationally active Americans, the top 3 match: Hindus, Jews, and Episcopalians. Well, let me throw another data point at you. The median age of a congregationally affiliated Episcopalian is 69. That means half are older than 69 and half are younger. The average age is 59. And I am not a biology professor, but what do we know about the fertility of highly educated, high-income 59-year-olds? Do they have a lot of children? No, they don't. So simply encouraging the people who already love us to have more children isn't going to solve the problem. I don't know about you, but my wife and I are in our 60s and we can't manage it. There are in places like the Diocese of Newark and the Diocese of New York and the Diocese of Long Island, where I grew up, Chinese-speaking congregations, Haitian Creole-speaking congregations, Spanish-speaking congregations. That is part of our future. Sometimes being a church of empire works out. The church where I was baptized in Brooklyn, a historic landmark in Crown Heights, cornerstone laid in 1886, is now an almost entirely West Indian congregation. Heavily immigrant and the children of immigrants, high church, incidentally, and home to an outstanding choir. When that part of Brooklyn changed, the church changed. More slowly than the neighborhood, but it changed, and today is healthy. We have a big job ahead, you and I. We have to speak to the rapidly growing army of the unchurched, who aren't even sure they want to have anything to do with church, and we have to speak to new Americans who may think that we are a church that doesn't have anything to say to them. And we have to leave the door open, the candles lit, to become a home for people who are leaving the churches of their own families' past. Sometimes the walking wounded who have been hurt or shamed or shown the door in congregations that were not living God's love. We have to aim for the head and the heart at the same time. And yes, trying to do all those things at once is hard. I knew it was hard when I suggested it, but really, what's the alternative? Reported sometimes with sorrow, sometimes with alarm, and sometimes with glee, each year brings new research, new surveys, new databases that agree on a few things. One, among all American adults, let's say from 18 to 80, a larger percentage every year have no religious affiliation, up drastically since as recently as 2000, whether raised with a religion in the family home and abandoning as adults, or in fact, never professing a faith identity, as it becomes more common and more mathematically likely that both members of couples forming households were raised without a religious affiliation. For people who left, there's sometimes been an abrupt departure after a last straw moment, or sometimes a simple drift away, a dissociation that isn't the result of a strategy. People just head on to new things. And a new, drastically higher percentage of people who are what demographers and social scientists are increasingly calling nuns, people with no religious affiliation. In just a handful of years, from 2007 to 2014, according to Pew, the percentage of unaffiliated adults rose from 16 to 23%. That's in one 7-year period. That's a steep trend line for just 7 years. And then it continued again for the 7 years after. There are, as you might expect, some regional variations, some parts of the country more affiliated than others, some drastically less. But there are now 20 states in which no religious group comprises a greater share of the population than the religiously unaffiliated. These 20 are heavily concentrated in the West and New England. 40% of Vermonters have no religious affiliation. Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and New Hampshire are among the states where Friday, Saturday, and Sunday can be more generally devoted to work, dog walking, the newspaper, or even a tea time. Second, as much as this trend is gaining strength across many age groups, it's the most pronounced among the under 30s, people who will be in their 50s in the 2050s. A majority of people born in the last decades of the 20th century and the earliest years of the new one say they attend religious services a few times a year at most. 36% of younger millennials, more than a third of those born in the 90s, are unaffiliated. In fact, among millennials, the unaffiliated are now the single largest faith group for want of a better term, outnumbering Roman Catholics and Protestants. In every metric of religious practice used by opinion researchers, prayer, reading scripture, attendance, giving money, saying religion is important in their lives, people born in the 80s and 90s are not just a little different from older people, but significantly so. So again, in 2025, what's the assignment? What are we supposed to do with that information and the daunting set of numbers undergirding it? If you want to consider this possibility, let's say inheritance, heritage, family custom mean less today in making individual Americans' religious choices. Okay, so let's posit that. Does that mean that congregations have a shot, a convincing argument, a convincing demonstration model, if you will, of what community and commitment, a life of joy looks like? That gives us a chance with people who 30 or 40 years ago never would have given us a second thought because they simply didn't think of themselves as the kind of people who became Episcopalian. That would mean all our varied home congregations can't any longer rely on people who were once relied on to organically become members, but we can also feel emboldened to appeal to a wider group of Americans. So the answer is a qualified yes, but yes, we do have a shot with a wider swath of the American church-going faith community. Before we even set out to do whatever it is we're going to do, we do have to admit to ourselves that our traditions, the way we commonly go about this, can be a problem for some people. Among America's religious bodies, there are wide variations in what might more ecumenically be called outreach, what a lot of Christians would familiarly call evangelism. Is there a reluctance for us to ask ourselves, to really ask ourselves what we have to offer? If you were to set out a more entrepreneurial path over the 75 years to 2100, would that mean climbing into the muck with toothpaste and detergent and canned soup and allowing us to think about this thing of ours that we think is good for us, good for the world, makes life saner and better and more coherent, heals the wounds of suffering humanity? Could we think of it like a product? Or do you recoil at that a little bit? How would you feel about that? Would that just mean being honest with ourselves? Or would that be a surrender of a sort and conforming to the ways of the world? I have to ask because I suspect that I'd get a lot of different answers across this virtual room about just how comfortable we are with the idea that religion is a product. What got you as an individual into this room on this night with the beliefs that you have, the worldview you have? How did you and your family become what you are? Might it be a result of centuries of wondering and arguing and praying and reading and studying and arguing some more and then getting on boats somewhere else in the world, or more recently planes, to bring those ideas and arguments and propositions here? Are you really ready to do that in a world where we can't even rely on getting a hearing, this rethinking of what it is we have to offer others? A world where our crowd might have once had the power to command, the authority to demand obedience. Can we now only use a softer kind of power? The answers about what to do in the future are not at all clear. Let's take a look at what were familiarly called the mainline churches, which have had a particularly bad half-century. They were the religious establishment in the United States, the thermostat that set America's religious temperature in the wider culture. They spoke with a loud voice, certainly in states like New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, but really across this country, particularly in the eastern half. What's happening now? Congregations dwindling in size, baptisms outnumbered by funerals, seminary graduating classes shrinking. And there's a paradox embedded there. As James Twitchell points out in his bracing, entertaining, and occasionally infuriating book, Shopping for God, young people have terrible associations with the very word Christian. We're too modest to even boast to ourselves that we are such a thing. We're trying to be. But a lot of our young people have only negative associations with the word Christian. And, we and the Lutherans, the Congregationalists and the Methodists might turn to those turned off kids and say, hey, but we're not like that. We're not the ones who are doing that stuff that you think you hate. But that can't, in and of itself, turn out to be sufficient. The churches that it might be argued contribute most strongly to those negative public impressions, they're in decline too. Just not as fast as the Presbyterian Church, the United Methodists, the UCC, the Evangelical Lutherans, and so on. And for me, here's where things get confusing. The news is full of the highly politicized parts of the wider church because of their ferocious reaction to marriage equality, the cruel slanders against the lives of gay people, the ideas about gender and worship, the unforgiving harshness of the public posture of some of these religious groups. And again, you may respond, but we don't do that stuff where I go. Yet those religious bodies have suffered far worse contraction than the Southern Baptists, who you might think some of us in a private conversation might submit are doing that. In Unchristian, What a New Generation Really Thinks About Christianity, David Kinnaman of the Barna Group, which is an evangelical public research organization, looked at polling among 16 to 29-year-olds and found the three main attributes associated with Christianity by young adults were anti-gay at 91%, judgmental at 87%, and hypocritical at 85%. 7 of the top 10 words associated were negative. What would people say about the places where you're a member, where you pray, where you give your affection and your energy and your money? I keep reading about the dissatisfaction with big box religion, and at the same time, the religious organizations that have rigorous training of congregational leaders and teachers, the congregations that remain faithful to the traditions of teaching and preaching, music and prayer, are the places, with few exceptions, suffering the worst contractions in numerical terms. My observations have nothing to do with any inherent wisdom or inherent superiority of sticking with the old ways of deep scholarship and theological study and organs and choirs and architecture, of using an older form of English in prayer. I'm speaking strictly in market terms. What you might be thinking about, talking about at a leadership meeting in your own congregation, as you contemplate how many of the young people in your city could someday join you, whether couples will raise children in your congregation, whether those kids brought up in our traditions and values will in turn bring up kids in and around the congregation. The last 30 years have demonstrated there are few easy rewards that come from us just being us, of keeping the faith, of being well and truly who we are and continuing to do that. Its internal logic is clear, but it's not responding to significant change among what younger Americans want from an experience, what they want from any organization they join. When I looked out at my classes at Amherst College when I was teaching there, I saw young people, smart, engaged, curious about the world, utterly unaware and uninterested in the difference between an Episcopalian, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, and a Catholic. Might be second nature to you, it's all irrelevant to them. Their experience is not our experience. They don't think they need fixing, and they don't think they're missing a thing, and they don't think we offer them anything they're looking for, at least not at first glance. At the same time, when I press young people about where they find community, where they find sustenance, connection, personal interaction that congregational membership has long provided, one of their common answers was online. And I know in these conversations I might have sounded like I was 100 years old, but I had to push back, suggesting that the quality of connection, the depth and tangibility of connection found online was just of a different quality. Let's just say we had a difference of opinion there, but there's something very important about the way people find community online. You find each other because of the things you already share. In many cases, things you already agree on: cultural enjoyments, political opinions, hobbies, pastimes. The personal computer and the telephone, which has become an astoundingly powerful extension of your computer, have revolutionized modern life. How we do everything: talk, work, consume goods, and consume information. I guess then it's no surprise that it's a radically transforming piece of technology, and it's changed how we act with each other. One aspect of online community that bears real watching for the purpose of this topic is that these communities are easy to opt into, easy to drop out of, demand very little of the people who opt in, and aren't even aware when people opt out. I can't fathom the meaning of belonging when you're talking about a group where few people know you're there and just about nobody misses you when you leave. How much did they ever really know you or care about you? They often don't even know your real name, since it's so easy to be anonymous online or live there under a pseudonym. Online is a world that offers placelessness, a you that is shorn of all place-specific identity, a you that can be almost anywhere. Contrast all that with what has conventionally been assumed to be a part of congregational life, being in a specific place where you come together with other people, seeing others, being with them as you do it, people with whom you share as part of the design of the place, major life milestones: birth, marriage, rites of initiation, illness, reconciliation, death. If you're part of a congregation, this is all familiar stuff. If you didn't grow up in one, you may not know what you're missing, but also, because you don't know what you're missing, not crave it or seek it out. When I talk to Episcopalians, I ask them to think about what it is we have to offer someone who's not been part of the kinds of things we do and the ways we do them. What's our value proposition? What is it that people want for their lives that we can help supply? At an earlier time in American history, there was more palpable social pressure to attend, a kind of feeling of community standards, fear of clerical scolding, fear that people will talk. I would suggest that in 2025, in very few of our neighborhoods across the country, will you be talked about if you don't show up in church one or another Sunday. Who would care? Whose opinion do you care enough about to be sure that you'll make it next week if you don't make it this week? Now, that lack of social pressure has a downside. That means on any given Sunday, there are fewer people with their butts in the seats to hear the message and perhaps be energized, revived, hooked by what they hear, challenged by it. The upside is that you know who you've really got to work with as you pull your little army together to go out and change the world. You don't have people who are only there because they felt some pressure to be there. The people who are there really mean to be there. Sociologists talk about strong bond and weak bond affiliations. If you're an organizational leader, you probably want to have some kind of answer to the question, who's going to be here next week? Right along with who's having trouble in their marriage, who's ill, which teen is having a crisis and wanted to talk to me. This kind of enmeshed life, an intentionally enmeshed life, is at odds with what some people want today. It's not easy in and easy out. It's a place where someone's going to know if you've had setbacks, where people are going to lift you up and take care of you if you're sick or lonely or in trouble. There's hunger for that kind of relationship, a yearning for the simple grace of being known, with or without having to accept any supernatural explanations for the state of the world, without having to be a student, without having to be a practitioner. But they do want to be in each other's faces. We have to find a way to offer that. In Britain, two stand-up comedians, Sanderson Jones and Pippa Evans, asked themselves what people had wanted that made church in the UK so successful for so long. They wanted companionship, they wanted to learn something, and they wanted to talk about things that were important to them, and they wanted to sing. So Jones and Evans started something called Sunday Assembly, a weekly gathering without God whose motto is live better, help often, wonder more. In the last 6 years, Sunday Assembly has come to the US, Australia, Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. It does bear watching. Many Sunday assemblies began with great optimism and large crowds and energy and ended in waning attendance and finally closure. Just like the churches they emulate. In the mix of possibilities later this century, will new bodies like this attempt to find the things people yearn for, if they don't also yearn for religion, and step in and do the work of forming these new vessels? You might want to think for a minute about the fact that the two self-appointed prophets of a new church-like but God-free way of community are stand-up comedians. Let's sit with that for a moment. In the eye-opening journey among America's nuns, written by religion professor Elizabeth Drescher, Choosing My Religion, this scholar of American religion noticed something interesting. A lot of young adults raised in a religious household are not hostile to religious practice, not hostile to faith. Many tell scholars, on the contrary, they value what they were taught as youngsters when their parents dragged them to church. Over time, they just drifted out the door. As was mentioned, my daughter is an Episcopal priest working in Manhattan, and the 20s and 30s ministry is a busy, lively church within a church. A lot of the members are new to town because of the nature of New York, brought to New York by work or school and they're looking for connection and community and finding it by either coming in from another branch of the church or returning to the church home of their childhood, without having to get married and have kids to do it. The old idea when we let people go out the door around college time was, oh, they'll come back. They'll boomerang back when it's time for their big life milestones. But people are getting married older and older. The age at first marriage is approaching 30. The age at first childbirth is around the same. And waiting for a 13-year or 12-year boomerang is more of a roll of the dice than hoping that we can recapture them in 4. I told my son when he left for college that I would never order him to go to church or even ask him to go to church after bringing him there myself for his whole life. Let's remember it's not just institutions that have declining authority, it's fathers that do too. But I pointed out that moving to a new place and living among thousands of strangers is hard whenever you do it. But that if he wanted to find people who he knew and recognized and got him right away, the Episcopal chaplaincy on his campus would offer that instant community. And it worked. He was active in all 4 years. He was elected student leader of the Episcopal chaplaincy in his senior year. And years later, he's not sure there's a God, but he is sure that he wants his child, who arrives in March, my first grandchild, to be baptized before he goes back to China where he lives. How exactly should we reach a 25-year-old who went to church, not even necessarily one of ours, new to town, coming back to a community after leaving for college? That young adult who hasn't been to synagogue since his bar mitzvah, or maybe to say Kaddish for a recently deceased family member, and has no plans to return. What do you say? I mean, everybody's wrestling with this, not just us. One prescription is to just keep on doing good work, being us, and the ones that'll find us will find us. Or make intentional outreach to young people while trying to craft something that answers their specific needs, the tug they feel, but doesn't feel too churchy. Is there a way of offering welcome, saying we don't care so much about your religious resume, at least at the beginning, come as you are and come as who you are? Whatever shape you're in when you hit the front door, seeker, sinner, fellow traveler, let's make the barriers to entry low and get to work on people once they're inside. One strong possibility exists in us thinking of the main act not only in the nave. For a portion, maybe even the largest portion of our people, worship will remain at the center of our life together, but increasingly, the vibrancy of our institutions will lie in worship and elderly drop-in, in worship and after school, in worship and nursery school, in worship and the feeding program. In the interest of long and relevant life, there will be people who think of our places as vital to their life, central to how they want to live, who never or rarely attend worship. Are they us? Are they part of us? Would they be included by the wardens, by the bylaws as a member? By 2050, will we be able to enforce those kinds of rules for membership? What will membership mean at a time of looser voluntary association? I think that's a key question for us going forward. As America, as she will be in mid-century, will affiliation the way we thought of it in the last century, in 1950, still make sense? Is it a valid and legitimate choice to say, no, we will not change shape to conform to a changing culture? Let's hold fast to what got us from 1534 all the way to today. And if it's good enough, it'll be good enough. I'm not going to answer that one for you. There's a whole world here in northern New Jersey who would love to have what we have. We have to believe that's true. Tremendous opportunity lies with the unchurched and with new Americans. And I hope we don't let those exciting possibilities pass us by. If you, like me, want the Episcopal Church to be something more than a property management firm that runs a club for nice people on Sunday, you've got to be a part of this next chapter. And if you do that, maybe I will stick around for the bicentennial. I'll only be 117 years old. Thanks for having me with you.
Is there more?
Bishop, I think you're muted. I've just lost you.
Yeah, no, I just,
There you
just found it. Thanks. Well, friends, first of all, thank you, Mr. Suarez. That was just wonderful and stirring, and sounds very familiar to a number of people I know. We've been having these conversations. We have some time for questions. So, John, if you'll help me just notice who's got a hand up, so you can either raise a physical hand or use the hand raise function. Questions or comments? Responses.
Comments are cool too.
Mhm.
So feel free to raise your hand and or pop a question in the chat. We'll be happy to help. Nancy McDonald, go right ahead.
This is my question. So, we have a little church in Little Falls, and we have a thriving food pantry. And we have many people who volunteer for the food pantry, but choose not to join our parish. So, what is it that they're getting from the volunteer at the food pantry that they feel that they don't need to join our parish?
Well, there have always been those people. It's just that before, our congregations weren't in such decline that we felt like we needed them as badly as we need them now. Maybe they're waiting for an invitation. I don't know. I guess it varies from person to person. Some of them don't think of themselves as churchy, or have been hurt very badly by the places they grew up in. I hear terrible stories, and it just breaks my heart because I can't imagine people who were weekly attenders at a church saying some of the things that these people heard before they left. I can't imagine clergy saying the things that these people heard before they left, but they often have to linger in our company for a while before they're willing to delve into something deeper. Some people just want to do food pantry work. They're atheists. They're not interested in church at all, but they know that you guys are doing good work, so they'll be with you for that. That's the thing that we can agree on. We'll do this thing together. So some of them are gettable, and some of them just aren't.
And we've gotten parishioners from who were volunteers of the food pantry. That's how we've gotten new church members, but no longer, and it's just sad that why these volunteers just feel that they don't want to come to church. It's sad.
Well, I would, if you feel comfortable, if you feel like you know them well enough to have that conversation, invite them to come with you. Sometimes that feels like a big threshold to cross. We do this thing together every week. We know each other on that level, on that basis, but actually asking them to come with you next week might feel like a upping the ante in a way that maybe they don't feel comfortable with. But if you know them well enough, if you sort of have a sense of them, it might be worth another ask. Not to just come, but to come with you. I think that's a different thing.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Paul Rajan, go right ahead.
Thank you, John. Reverend Ray, you started your speech with reference to vantage. I'm a bit curious for you to unpack that a little more. And I'm sure John King will agree. His dad was here, he grew up, and I'm the priest of the church in Vantage, which is 154 years old this year. And I also want to echo what Nancy just said. We have a food pantry in Vantage Church, and last week alone, we fed 102 people come through that red door. Now, after my time here, we have created something called Shepherd Care Team, because our church is Good Shepherd. And Shepherd Care Team invites these beneficiaries not just to come and get some food and go, but also to have engage them in conversation. Where are they in their life and what brings them here, kinds of stuff. And we do see some result, but still it's a long way to go for them to be part of the Episcopal Church. But I do see some prospects in that. Quite a few comes and asks for prayers, attends the services, and 2 or 3 have, got inducted. But I'm curious about your reference to that.
Well, it's a dinner speaker's trick Maybe it's a preacher's trick too. I mean, your website has a map of where all the parishes are. So I went on that to look, and there, all by itself, out up in the far reaches of the diocese, near the borders with New York and Pennsylvania, was Wantage. So I went to your website, learned a little bit about the place, and when you are talking to a real room or a virtual room full of strangers, if you pick out details that are familiar to them, you close that gap and you aren't as much strangers anymore. But it's a place that, because I have family in far upstate New York near the Canadian border, and it is a soul-destroying drive to go from Clinton County, New York, all the way down to Washington, D.C., on the New York Thruway and I-95. Sometimes if we have a little time, we'll go west instead through the Delaware Water Gap and through that part. And so it just tickled me that it was up there on its own, which is why I picked it out.
Okay, some of my siblings in this diocese tells me, oh, you are from the last church. I tell them, no, I'm from the first church from the other side. Thank you.
Donna Caputo.
My question is, as a person who is on the First Third of Life Commission and who has worked with youth, young adults, and families for a very long time, my big thing has been that our typical church service, a 10 a.m. service, doesn't work for today's modern families. And I've seen it in churches in the South that they do like a modern service in the evenings. What is your feeling on going with the non-traditional time slots?
Well, in my experience, the late Sunday service is always a good intention, but it hasn't worked a lot in the places where I've been. Like, it sounds like a great idea and it's well planned, and then in some cases beautifully executed, but always lightly attended. I think, but in general, the principle of finding ways to not make Sunday morning the only game in town is what is, in more general terms, going to work for more people. If we center our entire life together on one 4-hour period of one day of the week, I don't know if we're really fit for today's marketplace, if we're going to be a place that people are going to seek out. We have to find touch points in other times in the week and find touch points that are sacramental in their way, even if they're not worship.
Thanks, Donna. Any other questions? Yes, Marissa Moore. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. So, Mr. Suarez, I am in the company. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. I am in the company of cradle to, well, not grave yet, Episcopalians. But I am a cradle, and I will be to the grave, public radio listener. And I, not only that, I'm from Minnesota. So your story earlier. So anywho, tell me, as a public, a member of public radio, a pro on public radio, how does your faith inform your discussions, especially in light of the way Christianity is being portrayed by our government today? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think the if we think of Christianity as a brand in contemporary American society, it's a brand under very heavy stress. And those parts of the church that thought it would be a good idea and good for saving souls to sign up and hook up and hitch their wagon to politically powerful people to join them at the hip, I think they made a cataclysmic error, a huge generations-long error that will take us some time to get out of. And yet, at this very moment, people like Paula White are talking about how when she walks on the White House ground, she turns it into holy ground, into sacred ground, and then starts speaking in tongues. I am willing to give broad license to her to be her kind of Christian, and just need to be left alone to be my kind of Christian, but I do resent the damage that it's done to the reputation of the church to have the name of Christianity associated with governmental power and seen as a means of gathering more power and more influence by ambitious politicians who see an interest in fashioning their appeals, their messages, dropping in a little epistles into their speeches as a kind of wink and a nod to people in the audience who know their scripture. I just think it's been just a disaster for us as a broader community. And in 2005, I wrote a book called The Holy Boat, The Politics of Faith in America. And I said, I'm not writing this because I think it's bad for politics to be associated with religion, which is what everybody's talking about. What's it going to do to politics to be associated with religion? I asked people to consider at that time what it was going to do to religion to be associated with politics. And I feel now that the book is coming up on 20 years old that I hate to say, I'm always modest about saying I was right, but boy, was I right about that. It hasn't done the church, capital T, capital C, in its broadest sense, any good at all. And the damage continues to be done now. With a person who is biblically illiterate in the faith, knows only a couple of catchphrases that he knows he can throw out to gullible and susceptible crowds, and it's just been a disaster. I really can't exaggerate enough. Now that I don't work in a Daily Deadline newsroom anymore, I'm giving myself license to say that out loud. I just don't think it's been good for the church at all, and continues to do damage every day.
I appreciate that. Thank you very, very much.
Okay. Elaine Divebliss, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Wow, that was really close. Dival Bliss.
No.
Hello, I'm a member of St. Elizabeth's in Ridgewood, and I wanted to follow up on the remarks because they really hit home for me personally. I was raised I'll say devout Lutheran in Western Pennsylvania, in an area that has fallen squarely into, it was purple and now it is red, and it is very red. And my mother, who I adored and who raised me in the Lutheran faith, and I could sing songs that you would all recognize from Sunday school. They were all about inclusion and loving one another and taking care of one another. I watch my mom and her Lutheran friends. They've moved so far to the right. We can't have a dialogue about religion anymore. And I'm wondering, what advice you have for bridging exactly this gap that we're talking about as Christians who ostensibly share a faith, but in many instances, little more. I'm struggling personally, but I know, as a country and as a Christian faith, we are struggling in a big way to have, those conversations. How do we even start them?
Stick to what? Well, my advice might not be very helpful in this regard, but I always try to stick to what's essential. And what's essential is not arguing over Leviticus and arguing over angry, mean Paul, but getting back to Jesus and how Jesus seemed to contemplate the challenge of being in the world. He was going to leave it soon enough on a daily basis, so he didn't have to. Jesus never got to have a gray beard or have to worry about retirement or any of those things. But the way that we have turned certain ideas into political ones it borders on the sinful. There's nothing political about being decent instead of cruel. That's not a political choice. It's a choice about whether you want to be humane or not. And then we can argue about means. Politics is often about means. And somehow things like putting 2-ton granite monuments of the Ten Commandments in order to throw it down like a trump card and say, there you go, liberals, get a load of that. 2.5 tons of granite Ten Commandments in the front entrance of the courthouse. And then you go ahead and either in spirit or in fact violate them one by one. A lot of this stuff is political because we've allowed body English and tone and shadings and our ideas about other parts of our lives to be construed as political. So I'm sure there are a lot of people who, when I traveled in various dead red parts of the world, and it always takes me aback a little bit as a guy who grew up in Brooklyn to have people ask me where I go to church 5 minutes after we've started talking to each other. Not done where I come from. But, somebody will inevitably say to me, well, Ray, now that we're talking, where do you fellowship? And I'll tell them I'm an Episcopalian, and that's all I have to say. They have a whole long set of assumptions and associations. We never should have gotten there. It never should have gotten there, but there we are. And if they're going to make assumptions about me, I can't stop them. But they're going to have to watch not what I say, but what I do and how I treat the people that I have to deal with. And in decades of interviewing people live and unrehearsed on the air, I did it with kindness and with respect and with decency and with fairness. And that should say more about me than the fact that I've got these St. Andrew's crosses on my tie. Don't get carried away with this stuff. Watch what I do and not what I say. It's really hard. I mean, I don't want to trivialize what you're saying. It's really hard right now because we've gotten all kinds of non-essentials wrapped up with the essentials. And once you do that, it's like putting sugar in somebody's coffee when they don't take sugar. You can't get it out once it's in there. So they just have to get a whole other cup of coffee.
Deacon Len Roberts, please unmute.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Mr. Suarez, for your presentation. It's been very helpful and insightful. I really appreciated it. I'm just curious if you think a more effective use of online technology in the future would be a way of really getting our Christian message out. It seems as though that, young people and obviously the world, the nation we live in, with Amazon delivering, you don't even have to go to the mall anymore, and supermarkets, you just order online. And is that a more effective use to be able to really be able to get our message out there to track people, as opposed to hoping that they would come to our churches?
It's a great question, and it's a great question because once upon a time, not even that long ago, my answer would have been totally different. In the old media world, the Episcopal Church produced radio and television shows, and they were nice, and they were slightly lame, and nobody watched them. And that was bound to not do well. But in the 600 channel universe, we actually have more of a shot because we're back to being on some kind of weird level ground that we weren't with ABC, NBC, and CBS. But you know, ABC, NBC, and CBS aren't themselves anymore either. They are not the the bodies that blot out the sky with their hugeness and ability to dictate the weather. We are actually more competitive in online messaging in a fractured, mosaic-sized media universe than we would have been when giants roamed the earth. So I would, if anybody asked me, if the new presiding bishop asked me, I would say it would make more sense for us to get back into that game now than it was when in the 80s and 90s, I was sometimes asked to assist on some of these programs, which were worthy and lovely and unwatched and unlistened to. So it's a great question, Deacon, because the landscape has changed in such a way that the mighty have been laid low and the low places have been raised up, and we actually can compete more effectively than at times in the past, I think. And, you know, the pandemic was a really rigorous, tough school for us to learn how to keep reaching out to our people. And I saw all different ways of doing it. I've just come off of 8 years on the chapter of National Cathedral. And National Cathedral made a serious investment in reaching online congregations and have really succeeded tremendously in bringing thousands of people to regularly sign in and watch worship from around the country and even around the world, and to send in checks, incidentally. And they are now part of an online congregation, and there's even a canon for online ministries now from National Cathedral, because it succeeded so well during the pandemic that we now see it as a very fertile way of reaching out to people. My own church, St. Columba's Church in Northwest Washington, D.C., made Sunday morning worship into kind of a TV program. So it wasn't just pointing a camera at the altar and watching this week's worship roll out, but a slightly edited product with families leading various parts of the common prayer together on camera, interlaced with that week's gospel reading and that week's sermon and so on. And it was more of a produced product, and that was their approach to doing it. And some places just never got the hang of it, and maybe they didn't learn the right lessons, or didn't have congregations that were willing to follow them online during those terrible days where in many dioceses around the country our churches were closed. But I think the pandemic was really a school, and I don't want there to be another pandemic for us to go back to school on this, but it ought to have gotten us to think about ways that we can use these wonderful machines in order to further that work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn. David Baran, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. Suarez. Listened to you over the years on NPR, and always have enjoyed things you've had to say. I had the benefit of being baptized at St. Elizabeth's a few decades ago, and Father Andy's the fourth pastor there I've been working with. But anyway, my question, I think back at a time in my youth when we had Reinhold Niebuhr on the national scene as an Episcopalian on a national level talking about what it means to be Christian. And I see on Facebook these days, you say you're Christian and all of a sudden, you're intolerant, you're anti-immigrant, all these things that we're obviously not. Then it was brought to the fore with Bishop Buddy down in Washington a couple weeks ago of, the quality of mercy is what it means to be a Christian. And sort of the question is does this give us an opening to sort of re-engage at a higher level, on a national level, what it means to be Christian, and to sort of take away the ownership of the brand that you were talking about from the evangelical Baptist side that is referenced by a lot of the Southern TV preachers, and bring it more back into a not an advertisement, but a promotion about what some of the mainline branches are what we believe in.
As it happens, I spent a big chunk of yesterday with Bishop Buddy, and she was overwhelmed. There was a tsunami of feedback, some of it terrible and cruel and vituperative, but more of it in the atta girl category. And she took a great deal of encouragement from that. People were hungry for that. And, if you ask somebody to be merciful instead of cruel, and they think of that as a harsh indictment, it's them who's got the problem, not you or how you said it. But I think that's one of those moments. There was another when Bishop Curry preached at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Every now and then we have these little pops of national attention, and I think we make the most of them. And I asked her whether she had a decision to make about how to handle this moment, whether there were places that she was turning down and places that she was accepting. Did she have to be very choosy about where she went? And in the opening first flush of those post-homily days, she basically took the position that the more people she spoke to about this, the better. And I agree with that. As someone who's done this kind of thing for a living for a long time, I don't think there's any downside to going on The View. I saw online some criticism against her for going on The View. And I said, how many millions of people watch The View? She'd be nuts to say, no, I'm not going to go on The View because it's not dignified enough, or it's not holy enough, or something. You go where there are people to hear you. And not everybody's going to dig it, and not everybody's going to want it, but you go. And I think she was absolutely right. She reports that it is starting to die down now. But it was a moment that we should be looking for opportunities like that one. It was not an accident. I was on a chapter the last time we had a prayer service to welcome in a new Trump administration, and each side sends a committee to negotiate, to parlay about how to put this service together. And the last time, they made the recommendation of the homilist, and it was Pastor Jeffress from Dallas, and he gave a very, very political homily. And it was, all right. I mean, it's Pierre L'Enfant's imagined great church for national purposes and a house of prayer for all people. So if Pastor Jeffress ends up in the pulpit and says what he's got to say. Okay, that goes with the territory. But this time when the two committees met, Bishop Buddy said, no, I'm going to be the homilist. And she insisted that this time she was going to be the one up in the Canterbury pulpit, the last pulpit from which Martin Luther King delivered a Sunday sermon. And she said what she had to say, which now has been reverberating around the country. Sometimes, I mean, you can't just set out to catch lightning in a bottle. But I think that when you do, you have to make the most of that moment for however long it lasts, and use it to its good, to its potential. And I think she did.
Thank you.
We are at the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for listening, but also want to do a thank you, whether it's hands or clapping, or I know it's hard for us all to make noise at the same time. We do know how to do that in Northern New Jersey. But to thank Mr. Suarez so much for your time with us. And I especially hope we take out with us, please do get the book. We have a lot of thinking to do about new U.S. citizens. And I'm aware that many of our churches are surrounded by a population of 20 to 40% Spanish speaking. And most of our churches don't look like that and have no ministry to those folks, and are quick to tell me sometimes, oh, there's no Spanish speaking people in this town. And I'm like, census data says something completely different. It's Northern New Jersey. So new citizens, that's somebody we really need to be looking for. So I trust that your book will keep us thinking more and more about them. And I really appreciate that subject very much. So thank you, and thanks to all of you. I also want to take a minute to thank the 150th Anniversary Committee, the Sesquicentennial Committee, and their committee members on this call. If you would raise your hand so people can see you wherever you are. Thanks to all of you, and thank you for being here tonight. And again, a special thank you to Father Andy Olivo, who was the organizer of this part. And I just remember when it was a long list of possibilities, and it just seemed like, are we ever going to get from possibilities to confirmed names? And he very persistently kept at it until we had 4 confirmed names. So grateful to you, especially Andy, for making this little dream come true. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. God bless you. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Mhm.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ray.
Good night,
Very good job.
everybody.